Who is Jesus? I have no idea who Jesus is.
I don't know if it exists, but I believe in him.
I think it's a person who lived ages ago.
Who is Jesus? He is the Son of God in the Christian faith.
Jesus for me is also a prophet.
He probably was just some fella who walked around with a beard and and a bottle of wine in his back pocket and switched the water with the wine a couple of times, and everyone loved him.
Jesus to me is somebody we got taught about in infants and junior school, really.
It's how many millions of people celebrating his birthday. No one celebrates my birthday like that, so surely he must have existed.
Jesus is my God.
He's someone that, I can relate to, I can pray to, I can talk to.
The Son of God, but apparently we are all God's children. So then what is so great about Jesus?
I was born and bred in a beautiful little town just north of London called Luton. And I always feel actually I have to apologize for that. And I don't know why it is. I think it's because maybe it's one of those places which at first glance appears to have very few redeeming features. But I can tell you, because I grew up there and I spent 22 years of my life there, once you scratch beneath the surface, it has none, actually. But I love it. It's my hometown. I'm very fond of it. And I think it's just one of those places where you have to look a bit closer to find the beauty. So here's the view from the house that I grew up in. And it might just look like a normal kind of corner shop with bollards outside it to stop ram raids. And that is what they're for. But actually, it takes quite a lot of effort to paint everything exactly the same shade of green. And I think that's what I mean. You just have to look a little bit closer to see the beauty in places like my hometown. And actually, my parents had been missionaries in China, and they moved back to England before I was born. So church and faith were part of my life from actually a really young age. And then I went to quite a rough school. Actually, it was the worst school in Luton. It's quite a difficult thing to achieve. And these days you would call it a failing school, largely because it failed and they knocked it down. But when I started that, I realized I was one of only 2 or 3 people out of 800 who had any kind of faith or went to church. And I suddenly realized you didn't have to believe all these things. And lots of people didn't. You didn't have to believe these things I'd kind of been brought up with. And at the same time, lots of my friends at church stopped coming and they kind of walked away from their faith. So I was forced to work out for myself what I actually believed about Jesus. And there came a point where I had to make a decision based on the evidence. Is all this stuff I've been brought up with real? Is it true? I couldn't just believe something that wasn't true. I couldn't just put my head in the sand and pretend it was true. I couldn't just take some kind of blind leap of faith. I needed some evidence. And for me personally, evidence has always been very important. After Luton, I went to read law at Oxford. And in fact, I studied and worked as a lawyer for 10 years and actually worked as a barrister specializing in defending people accused of crimes. And over the years, I represented hundreds, maybe 1,000 people who were accused of crimes. And it's great so many of you have turned out tonight. But every case I worked on, the first question was always, what is the evidence about the events? How does the case stack up? What do people say about what happened? Every question, every day I asked for years was, what is the evidence? And when it comes to who is Jesus, I'm convinced by the evidence. But what evidence is there? Well, you can't prove Christianity mathematically. You can't prove it scientifically. Science, of course, answers the questions how and when. It doesn't answer the questions who and why. So suppose I invited you over to my house this weekend. We've only just met, but you seem like a nice bunch. And we kind of came in and we walked through to the kitchen and the kettle was boiling. You say, why is the kettle boiling? And I could answer that question a number of different ways. I could say, well, the kettle boiling because there's a heat source in the kettle and there's a transfer of thermal energy across the container wall, passing into the fluid and causing an increase in the mean square velocity of the molecules proportionate to the temperature. And when that hits 100 degrees Celsius, there's a collective phase transition by which the condensed liquid expands into a gaseous state. Could say that. Or I could just say, the kettle's boiling because I kind of like you and I wanted to make a cup of tea and get to know you. They're both really good answers to that question. One explains exactly what is happening and how it's happening, but the other explains who's initiated that process and why. One tells you what's actually happening, but another tells you why. And there are some things that only the maker can reveal, actually. Science is so important, but it tells us how things happened. It doesn't tell us who and why. And the questions who and why are a matter of faith, actually. It takes as much faith to be an atheist as it does to be a Christian, because you can't prove that there is no God scientifically, just as you can't prove that there is a God scientifically. It's a matter of looking at the evidence. And I want to look at the historical evidence. Scientific evidence, it's not the only kind of evidence. For lawyers, historical evidence is highly important. That's the sort of evidence that you put before a jury. The jury, they're not witnesses to events. Every time a jury comes back and delivers a verdict, takes that step of faith, they're taking a step of faith based on historical evidence that they've heard about what happened. And I myself could not be a Christian if it needed me to take some kind of blind leap of faith without any evidence. For me, it's a question of taking a step of faith based on good historical evidence about the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. But sometimes people say, well, hang on a second. I don't even believe there is a God. Why are we suddenly talking about Jesus? And I might understand that. It might seem like putting the cart before the horse. But what I want to suggest is that if I want to know you, if I want to get to know you, I can know a little bit about you by observing you and seeing how you do things and looking at you and so on. But ultimately, I can only know you if you choose to reveal yourself to me. And it's the same with God. We can only know God if he chooses to reveal himself to us. And the claim of the New Testament is that God has done that, and he's done it kind of in a way that you might expect, or which makes sense. Because if God is going to reveal himself to us as human beings, what's the logical way to do that? It's to become a human being. And for me, it's actually the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus that convinces me that this world has a creator, and that creator is to be viewed through the lens of Jesus. So what is the evidence? How do we know, for example, that Jesus even existed? Well, the answer is that we do know Jesus existed. There's overwhelming historical evidence that Jesus existed. First of all, outside the New Testament, the Roman historian Tacitus talks directly about Jesus. The Roman historian Suetonius talks indirectly about Jesus. The first century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus said, there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if indeed it's lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. And he goes on to talk about his crucifixion and his alleged resurrection. So there's evidence outside the New Testament that Jesus existed. But more important, there's evidence inside the New Testament. And some say, well, the New Testament was written a really long time ago. How do we know that what they wrote has not been changed over the years? And the answer is, we do know very accurately through the science of textual criticism what the original writers wrote. And essentially the way this works is the more manuscripts we have and the closer in time they are to the original, the more sure we can be about the original. So a few examples. Herodotus and Thucydides were both written in the 5th century BC. The earliest copy we have is AD 900. There's a 1300-year time lapse, and we have 8 copies of each, and no classical scholar would doubt their authenticity. Tacitus, there's a 1,000-year time gap. We have 20 copies. Caesar's Gallic War, 950 years, 9 to 10 copies. Livy's Roman History, a 900-year gap, 20 copies. But when it comes to the New Testament, it is unique among ancient documents, both for the sheer number of manuscripts and the closeness in time to the original. So the New Testament was written between 40 and 100 AD. We have manuscript evidence as early as AD 130 and full manuscripts by AD 350. And we have 5,309 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin manuscripts, and 9,300 others. And that's why the classical scholar F.J. Hort, an expert in these things, said in the variety and fullness of the evidence on which it rests, the text of the New Testament stands absolutely and unapproachably alone amongst ancient prose writings. And again, no secular historian would disagree with that conclusion. So we know from evidence inside and outside the New Testament that Jesus existed, but who is he? Well, we know he was fully human. He had a human body. He ate, he drank, he sweated, he got tired, he suffered pain. He had human emotions, love, joy, sadness. He had human experiences. He had the experience of growing up in a family, of education, of having a job, of being tempted, bereavement, suffering, being tortured, and the experience of death. And many would say today, oh, well, okay, he was a human being, but he was only a human being. And maybe he was some kind of great religious teacher, but he was no more than that. So what evidence is there to suggest that he was more than just a great religious teacher? Well, there are two parts to this argument, really, because the first part is, who did Jesus think he was? Because if Jesus didn't think he was anything more than a human being, a great religious teacher, that's pretty much the end of the argument. And some people say, well, Jesus never claimed to be God. And it's right, he didn't kind of go around with a t-shirt on saying, I am God. But when you look at everything he taught and said, I think there's little doubt he was conscious of being a man whose identity was God. And that's the first part of the argument. And then the second part of the argument is, was he right? What evidence is there to support his claims? So firstly, what did he say about himself? Well, the teaching of Jesus centered on himself. Most great religious teachers, they point away from themselves. They say, don't look at me, look at God. But Jesus, in pointing people to God, pointed them to himself. He said, it's through me you come into a relationship with God. And I don't know how you're doing tonight as you sit here. I don't know if you're up or down, if you feel like you're absolutely smashing life, like you're hitting home runs for fun, everything's going just the way you planned, or if you feel like you're hanging in by your fingertips and it's actually really hard. And I've experienced both those things. I've had times in my life where I felt like I was doing really well, I was earning a lot of money, I had great holidays, I had a great life, I had a great job, I really enjoyed what I was doing, I loved, it was great fun working as a barrister. When you're working as a criminal defense barrister, you get to meet some really interesting people, like people that are alleged to run criminal networks are really interesting people. They're quite fun to be around. It's fun. And, you go to parties, and if you say, I defend people accused of crimes, people would be really interested. If you're a criminal barrister, like, oh, that's really interesting. And they'd be really interested in your job, and that's really fun to go to parties, and people think what you do for a living is interesting. And if they knew some of the people who worked in my sphere, because I had the privilege of working with, some of the best people in the country doing what they did, if they knew that sector, it was even better, because they'd say, oh, you work with them? They're brilliant. You must be brilliant. And I'd go, no. But inside I was thinking, yes. I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed that kind of fun and doing all that kind of stuff. And but what I found was that even though I had lots of things in my life that should satisfy, lots of good things, even with all the things I had in my life, I wanted more. It was never quite enough money. It was never quite enough success. It was never quite enough status. I had like a spiritual hunger. And Jesus said, I am the bread of life. If you come to me, that hunger will be satisfied. And that's what I found. And then there's the stuff in my life I don't like the bad habits, the stuff I find very addictive, like, comparing myself with others, or Instagram, which is basically the same thing. It's kind of, I love Instagram, but I don't know how you find it. You kind of scroll basically until you kind of feel like you're pretty content with your life. Yeah, my photos are a lot better. Everything's a lot better where I am than those people. Or you scroll until you see someone and you think, what? They're skiing this weekend and it's cold and wet, or they're on a beach in Bahamas with all these people, and you kind of end up comparing your kind of behind the scenes with everyone's highlight reel. And it can become a little bit addictive. And Jesus said, there's lots of stuff in my life that I found addictive. And Jesus said, if the Son, talking about himself, sets you free, if Jesus sets you free, you'll be free indeed. And that's also my experience, that Jesus set me free from all sorts of things, from a bad temper, from things like that. But other things, some things straight away, some things it was a much longer process. And then there's stuff like guilt, worry, anxiety, fear. I wonder if you've had the experience I've had. Like you make a mistake at work and it's a really big mistake and you're really worried about the consequences, or you have an argument with a friend or a disagreement with a friend and you can't quite see how that relationship is going to be restored, and you find yourself waking up at 2 a.m. in the middle of the night, kind of sitting up in bed, thinking about it, thinking, is it all going to be okay? And Jesus said, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. You'll find peace. Jesus said, if you receive me, you receive God. If you welcome me, you welcome God. He said, if you've seen me, you've seen God. And we've all probably come across people in life who maybe don't have a huge amount of modesty, seem to think they're God's gift to the world, think maybe to see what God looks like, they only have to look in the mirror. Maybe you've got a boss like that, or an ex. But Jesus didn't have a trace of arrogance in his nature. And he said, if you want to know what God looks like, look at me. So firstly, his teaching was centered on himself. But secondly, his indirect claims. Jesus put himself in a position which only God could be in. For example, Jesus said to people he had never met before in his life, your sins are forgiven. Like, people don't do that. People don't go up to people they've never met before in their life and say, your sins are forgiven. I mean, why don't you try that on the tube home tonight? Go up to someone you've never seen, your sins are forgiven. See how long it takes them to react. And the people who are listening to him, the lawyers who are listening to him said, wait a moment, to forgive those who've sinned against others, that's something that only God can do. Who do you think you are? And Jesus said, I've come to die for your sins, to make forgiveness possible. Right at the heart of Christianity is forgiveness. To be a Christian is to forgive the inexcusable in others, because God has forgiven the inexcusable in me. And the third piece of evidence is his direct claims, if you like. And we don't have time to look at all of them, but let's look at one. If someone says to you, Jesus never claimed to be God, and you've only got time to show them one verse, show them this verse. So the background is that a claim tantamount to a claim to be God was considered blasphemy in the eyes of the religious leaders, and it was considered worthy of death by stoning. And Jesus says this in John 10:30. He said, I and the Father are one. And again they picked up stones to stone him. Then Jesus said to them, I've shown you many great miracles from the Father. For which of these do you stone me? We're not stoning you for any of these, they replied, but for blasphemy, because you, a mere human being, claim to be God. Those who were around him, those who heard him and opposed him, were in no doubt about what Jesus was claiming. They said, you're claiming to be God, and they said, you deserve to die for it. So from his teaching, his indirect claims, his direct claims, the evidence is Jesus claimed to be God. Now, obviously, that's a remarkable claim, and it needs to be tested. But it seems to me there are three possibilities. Now, the first is that it wasn't true, and Jesus knew it wasn't true, in which case he was an imposter, he was a fraudster, and he was an evil one at that. Now, the second possibility is it wasn't true, and he really didn't realize it. He genuinely thought he was God, even though he wasn't. And we would call someone like that deluded or insane. But the only other logical possibility is that it's true. C.S. Lewis put it like this. He said, a man who was merely a man and said the sort of things that Jesus said wouldn't be a great moral teacher. He'd either be insane or else he'd be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else he's insane or something worse. But don't come up with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He hasn't left that open to us. He didn't intend to. So was Jesus right in what he claimed? What evidence is there to support what he said? Well, the first thing to look at is his teaching. The teaching of Jesus is widely acknowledged to be the greatest teaching of all time. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do to others what you would have them do to you. And then this, completely revolutionary. He was the first person to say it. Love your enemies. And Jesus' teaching has really been the foundation of the entire of Western civilization. Many of our laws were originally based on the teaching of Jesus. And think about this. We have advanced in almost every field of science. Think about all the technological advancements, even of the last 10 years. Nanotechnology, brain implants, Tinder. But in 2,000 years, no one's ever improved on the moral teachings of Jesus. They're the greatest words ever spoken. They're the kind of words you'd expect God to speak. And then his life, the things that he did. He must have been the most extraordinary person to be around. People sometimes say, oh, Christianity's boring. Well, it wouldn't have been boring being around Jesus. I mean, just imagine for a moment, you're facing a really serious moral, ethical dilemma at work, and you've got one phone call. Who do you phone? Who is your kind of go-to, calm in a crisis, wiser than their years, safe pair of hands friend? Why don't you just picture that person? Okay? And then I want you to imagine it's Friday night, you get a promotion or a bonus, really great news, you want to go out on the town, and you really want to hit it hard, and you really want to celebrate. Who's your always ready to party, fun, up all night, knows the bouncers at all the clubs, friend that you always want to hang out with? Okay, picture that person. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, they're very different people. Like, I wouldn't want to get them mixed up. It could get very messy. I'd phone for ethical advice, and I'd end up in a karaoke bar in Shoreditch at 4 a.m. Like, it's not a good look. But what I find fascinating about Jesus is, not only the greatest moral teaching, but he went to a party, the wine ran out, so he says, you see those stone jars over there, fill them up with 20 or 30 gallons of bathwater each, and start pouring them out for the guests. And they did, and it was the best wine of the night. Jesus was the one who kept the party going. Might surprise you. And not just his miracles, but his love for the loveless, his love for people who society had written off and excluded. And the way he set people free and still sets people free today. It's one of the things I most love about Jesus, the way he sets people free from all sorts of things. And of course, I suppose ultimately his death, laying down his life for his friends. And then his character. The character of Jesus has impressed millions who wouldn't call themselves Christians. Time magazine said this: Jesus is the most persistent symbol of purity, selflessness, and love in the history of Western humanity. His enemies could find no fault with him, and his friends who knew him well said, this guy is without sin. But as I'm sure you know, the real test of character is what we're like when we're seriously under pressure. When you make a mistake at work and your boss is screaming at you, or when a relationship on which we put all our hopes breaks down and we're not sure what way to turn. And when Jesus was being tortured, he said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And then there's his fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. No one else in the history of humanity has had a whole collection of books written about them before they were born. Jesus fulfilled over 300 Old Testament prophecies spoken by different voices over 100 of years, 29 of them in a single day. And some might say, well, maybe Jesus read the Old Testament. Maybe he was a clever con man. He read about these prophecies. He said, I'm going to go and fulfill all these prophecies. But it doesn't work not only because of the sheer number of them, but also because there are many things he simply had no control over. There are prophecies about the exact manner of his death, the place of his burial, even about the place of his birth. Imagine Jesus, reading the Bible, oh, goodness, I'm supposed to be born in Bethlehem. You're too late. But he was born in Bethlehem, something he had no control over. And then by far the most important, his conquest of death. The physical resurrection of Jesus from the dead is the cornerstone of Christianity. And it's so relevant to every single one of us here. Every one of us is going to die. I feel a little bit awkward bringing that up on a Wednesday night in South Ken. But it's true. It's the ultimate statistic. One in one of us in this room is going to die. And you might have noticed that we find that a little bit difficult to talk about. In the media, when a famous person dies, even in tragic circumstances, the death is reported, and then quite quickly we move on to talking about what an amazing person they were. It's almost as if we find it too hard to sit with the reality of death for more than a moment. I even heard of a hospital where they've forbidden the use of the word death. They have a much more politically correct way of speaking about it. They talk about a negative patient care outcome. But the fact is, we die. And, we've all probably got experiences of this, of seeing people we love die. I'll never forget going to the funeral of my good friend Jamie, who died in really tragic circumstances. And just going to the graveside and seeing his coffin and seeing it grow into the ground, and it looks so final. It looks like the end, and it is the end, unless death has been conquered. And that's the claim of the New Testament, that Jesus died and he was buried, and on the third day he rose again. And that means it's possible for every one of us to have eternal life. And that is an extraordinary claim. And it's the basis of hope of every funeral. But is it true? I mean, just because it's nice to believe doesn't make it true. And that's what matters. Is it true? So why do I believe that Jesus rose from the dead? Well, I hadn't actually realized how much evidence there is for the physical resurrection of Jesus. And there are 4 reasons I believe he rose from the dead. First of all, no one has ever really explained how Jesus' body was absent from the tomb on Easter Day. And some people say, well, maybe the authorities took the body. But that's not very likely at all, because if they had the body, all they had to do when people said, Jesus is alive, is to say, no, he isn't. We've got him right here. Ta-da. And they could have wheeled him out. Others might have said, well, maybe the disciples stole the body. And then they began a rumor that Jesus had been resurrected. But the tomb was guarded, heavily guarded. And it's also psychologically improbable. Here is a depressed, disillusioned group of people. Just look at what they had to go through for their beliefs. Why would the disciples have been willing to be tortured and die for something that they would have known, if they'd taken the body, was not true? And some say, well, maybe robbers took the body. And that's actually the least likely of all, because I haven't actually talked about the empty tomb, because the tomb was not empty. Jesus' body was absent, but when the disciples got to the tomb, they found the grave clothes, which were the only valuable thing, the only thing for the robbers to take. They had collapsed like a caterpillar's cocoon when the butterflies emerged. And the headpiece that had been around Jesus' head had been folded up and put in a separate place. And when they saw that, they believed. Now, the second reason I think Jesus rose from the dead is that not only was Jesus absent from the tomb, he was present with people. He was seen by many people on many different occasions. And sometimes people say, well, yeah, that's hallucination. And people do hallucinate. Kind of people who hallucinate are highly strung, imaginative people, those on drugs. But amongst Jesus' disciples, you had Thomas, who was the ultimate skeptic. You had tough, gritty fishermen, and you had Matthew, the tax collector. Tax collectors do not hallucinate. But in any event, it's highly unlikely that even 2 people would have the same hallucination. Jesus appeared on 11 separate occasions, on one occasion to more than 500 people at the same time. 500 people could not have the same hallucination. And then the third reason is the immediate impact. Here are a group of people who were discouraged, depressed, fearful, hiding. And something occurred that totally changed them. So that 3 days after his death, they were going around telling everyone, Jesus is alive. We've seen Jesus. And then you get this historical phenomenon we know about, which is the birth and the growth of the Christian church. And it's an extraordinary phenomenon without parallel, really, in the history of the world. Beginning with a group of basically fishermen and tax collectors, there is this explosion in 300 years right across the known world. And then the fourth reason I believe Jesus rose from the dead is the sheer number of people's lives who have been transformed by Jesus. More people now than ever before. And tens of thousands of people each day are placing their trust in Jesus. Today, 2,300,000,000 Christians in the world, all testifying to an experience of Jesus and an encounter with Jesus. And we have Christian experience through the ages, countless millions of people who've experienced the risen Jesus Christ. And it's people of every ethnicity, every continent, every nationality, every economic, social, and intellectual background, from all walks of life. They unite in this common experience of the risen Jesus. So when I look at Jesus' claims, what he said about himself, who he said he was, his teaching, his life, the fulfillment of prophecy, his resurrection from the dead, to say he was evil or deluded just seems to me to be unbelievable and illogical. So I'm left with the only other option. When I look at the evidence, it gives the strongest possible support to Jesus being a man whose identity was God. But there is all the difference in the world between head knowledge and heart knowledge. And I can be convinced of something in my head without it making its way to my heart. And when I placed my trust in Jesus, that knowledge made its way from my head to my heart. And Jesus said, I've come so you might have life, and life in all its fullness. And I tell you, I have had my ups and downs. I've been through difficulties, and I've messed up more times than I care to remember. I am far from perfect, but I've experienced what Jesus promised. It really is true that God has revealed himself in Jesus. Jesus really is who he claimed to be. Jesus really did rise from the dead. There is hope beyond this life. There is hope for this life. Right now, in an encounter with Jesus, we find life and life in all its fullness. And that's my experience of what Jesus came to bring. And that's why I believe that he is who he claimed to be.